My son was 3 years old, and my husband had been dead for 11 weeks when my mother called to tell me the workshop had been sold. She did not open with that. She opened with the weather and a question about whether Eli had adjusted to the new schedule, and I answered both because I was still in the phase of grief, where ordinary conversation felt like a service you could perform for other people, a way of reassuring them that you were managing. I had learned to perform managing. I had been performing it for 11 weeks for everyone who needed to see it. For Eli, for my clients, for the neighbors who brought food and needed to leave without having witnessed something too difficult. For my mother, who needed to believe that her daughter was holding together because my mother had always needed that and grief had not changed it. She said the thing she had called to say in the particular way she delivered difficult news, which was matter-of-factly, and with the specific conviction of a woman who has already decided the outcome and is informing you of it rather than consulting you. She said, "We took care of the Denton situation. The workshop sale closed last week. I wanted you to know. I want you to hold two things at once. The first is my son in the next room, 3 years old, playing with the wooden truck his father had made him in the workshop that my mother had just told me was sold. He was making the sound a truck makes when it goes over bumpy ground, which was a sound Gideon had taught him, and which he made with his whole chest and a cheerful seriousness that was entirely Gideon's. The second is the safe. The gray metal one, 4 feet tall, bolted to the concrete floor in the back corner of that workshop, the one my husband had shown me the combination to the week after we were married. He had said, "This is yours too. Whatever's in it is ours and then it's yours." My mother did not know about the safe. Nobody had known to look for it. Nobody had opened it. The sale had closed and the buyer had his closing documents and my mother had solved Denton's problem, and in the back corner of the workshop, on the concrete floor, the safe was still full. None of them knew what was in it. None of them saw what was coming when I opened it. Welcome to calm drama stories, where we sit with the quiet ones. The ones where the grief and the betrayal arrive at the same time, and you have to carry both of them through the same door. If you have ever had someone reach into your loss and take something before you had finished understanding what you had lost, this story is for you. Stay with me, because what was in that safe is not what anyone expected. And what it meant for a sale that had already closed is something a real estate attorney named Harriet is going to explain in a conference room in approximately 8 months, and I want to take you there. Subscribe and leave one word below for the last time someone mistook your silence for permission. I read every one. Now, from the beginning, my name is Vera Malone Strickland. I was 32 years old. My husband, Gideon Strickland, had died in March of a heart condition that had been identified 18 months earlier and that we had managed carefully and that had, despite the management and the medications and the cardiologist visits and the specific discipline of a man who wanted to stay alive for his son, killed him anyway on a Tuesday morning while he was making coffee. He was 37. He had been a cabinet maker. Not a hobbyist, not a side occupation. A full-time craftsman with a client list and a waiting list, and a workshop on a quarter-acre lot on the edge of town that he had purchased 7 years earlier, because the house we lived in didn't have space for what he needed to build, and because he had understood from the beginning of his career that the workshop was the business, and the business needed its own address. I want to tell you about who Gideon was before I tell you what my parents did to what he left behind. He had grown up in a house where things were repaired rather than replaced, where his grandfather had a basement workbench that smelled the way Gideon would later build his career around, and where the act of making something by hand was not a hobby or a statement, but a plain fact of how things got done. He had gone to a trade program instead of a 4-year college, and had spent 3 years working under a master cabinet maker in a city 3 hours from where we both grew up, and had come back knowing exactly what he was going to do with his life, and with no ambiguity about it at all. I had met him at 27, at the kitchen table of a mutual friend, where he was sitting in the specific way of a person who is comfortable taking up only as much space as they need. He was talking about joinery. I was a bookkeeper who had never thought about joinery in my life, and I listened to him for 20 minutes and understood that I was going to spend a great deal of time with this person. We had married at 29. He had been diagnosed at 36, 14 months before he died. He had not told me right away. He told me when the cardiologist had given him enough information to give me something specific rather than a fear, which was the kind of consideration for other people that characterized every decision Gideon made. He had sat me down at the kitchen table and he had said, "I have something going on with my heart. Here is what we know and here is what we don't and here is the plan." The plan was what it was. We followed it. He was disciplined about it in the way he was disciplined about everything, completely and without performance. He did not discuss the diagnosis at length. He did not make it the organizing principle of our daily life. He made the doctor appointments and took the medications and modified what he ate and reduced what he could reduce and kept working, kept building, kept going to the workshop every morning at 7 and coming home at 6 and eating dinner with us and putting Eli to bed and sitting with me in the evenings the way we had always sat together, which is to say like two people who were glad to be in the same room. He had not told me about the deed transfer. I understand this now. He had been doing the things that needed doing, in the background, quietly, because telling me would have required a larger conversation about why he was doing them, and he was not ready to have that conversation with me while he was still processing it himself. He had been a cabinet maker for 12 years, which means he had been building things that were meant to outlast the building of them for 12 years. That quality does not stay in the workshop. It shapes a person's whole way of moving through the world. Gideon built things that were supposed to hold. He applied that principle to everything he touched. He had applied it to me. I want to tell you about the workshop. It was a converted structure, originally a storage facility, that Gideon had spent 3 years transforming into the specific environment a cabinet maker needs. Temperature controlled for the wood. Dust collection system he had designed himself and installed over one summer. A finishing room with ventilation he had spec'd out and had inspected. A showroom at the front, small, 6 pieces at a time, always occupied by things in progress or things waiting for delivery, because Gideon believed that showing the work in progress was more honest than showing only the finished pieces. He had clients who had been waiting 2 years for their piece. He had a reputation in the city's woodworking community that was not loud but was absolute. The people who knew. The people who had commissioned a Strickland piece understood they were getting something that would outlast them, and they waited for it without complaint, because waiting for the right thing is how a person who understands quality behaves, and Gideon's clients were, by self-selection, the kind of people who understood quality. He had built everything in that house we lived in together. The kitchen cabinets, the bookshelves in the living room, the dresser in our bedroom with the inlaid top that I had asked for and that he had spent 3 weeks on, each piece of the inlay cut by hand. He had built Eli's crib, and then, when Eli outgrew the crib, the toddler bed with the carved animals on the headboard that Eli called his zoo. He had built the truck Eli was playing with in the next room when my mother called. The workshop was how he built all of it. The workshop was, in the most practical and specific sense, where Gideon's work had lived. Where his tools were arranged in the order he had arranged them, and the wood was stacked in the sequence he had stacked it, and the smell of sawdust and finishing oil had accumulated over 7 years into something that was entirely and completely his. In the back corner of the workshop, bolted to the concrete floor, was a gray metal safe, 4 feet tall. He had shown me the combination the week after we were married. His mother's birthday and Eli's birthday compressed into 6 digits. He had said, "This is yours too. Whatever's in it is ours and then it's yours." I had not been back to it since he died. 11 weeks. I had not been able to. This is a fact about grief that people who have not experienced it do not always understand. You cannot always go to the places that hold the person. Not because you will break, but because some rooms take longer than others to be ready to walk into again. I was not ready. My parents had been inside it. My parents had shown it to a buyer. My parents had signed something. My mother said on the phone, with the specific calm of a woman delivering news she has already decided is good, "We got $240,000 for it. Denton owed $215. There's a little left over. Denton is my brother. Let me tell you about Denton, because this story requires exactness about him. Denton is 2 years younger than me and has been, for most of his adult life, the kind of person whose problems arrive with a specific quality. They are always someone else's emergency. He is not malicious. I want to be accurate about that. He is the kind of person who moves through the world with a persistent and genuine belief that the people who love him will absorb the consequences of his decisions, and that this belief is reasonable because it has, historically, been correct. My parents had been absorbing Denton's consequences since he was 19. The business that failed, the investment that was never an investment, the lease cosigned, and then the lease defaulted. They had not always told me what they were absorbing, because they understood that I would have opinions about it, and that those opinions would be accurate and inconvenient. I had learned about each chapter of Denton's financial history in retrospect, months or years after the crisis had passed and the absorption had occurred, because that was how my parents managed the gap between the children. They protected Denton from the consequences of his choices, and they protected me from the knowledge that they were doing it. I had let this arrangement stand for years because the arrangement did not, until March, cost me anything I could point to. Now it had cost me my husband's workshop. The debt that required the workshop sale was $215,000 owed to a creditor, whose specifics I will not detail because they are Denton's, and not mine to put into a story. What I can tell you is that the debt was real, and the creditor was pressing, and my parents had decided, in the 11 weeks since Gideon died and I had been managing grief, and a 3-year-old and the paperwork of a death and the continuation of my own bookkeeping work, that the workshop could solve it. They had not asked me. I had not been asked because I learned later my mother had decided that I would say no and that no was not the answer the situation required. She had not factored in what I would say because she had decided my answer didn't govern the outcome. That is the sentence I want you to sit with for a moment. She had decided my answer didn't govern the outcome. There is a specific kind of love that expresses itself as management. It looks like caring. It functions as control. It makes decisions on your behalf that it tells itself you would have made anyway if you had been in a position to make them, which is to say, if you had not been inconveniently situated in grief. My mother had loved me in this way for 32 years, and it had not cost me anything irreplaceable until the Tuesday she told me the workshop had sold. I said to her on the phone in the particular voice I have learned to use when I am managing something very large in a very small amount of space, "Mom, that was Gideon's workshop." She said, "It was an asset, Vera. An asset you weren't using." I said, "It was his. It was ours." She said, "It's $215,000. Denton didn't have anywhere else to turn." I did not say what I thought about Denton's nowhere to turn. I said, "I need to make a call." My mother said she hoped I understood they had done what they had to do. I said, "I'll talk to you later, Mom." I hung up. I sat in the silence of my house, which was full of Gideon's work on every surface I could see. The kitchen cabinets he had built for me, the bookshelves with the beveled edges he had spent 2 weekends on, the dresser in our bedroom with the inlaid top, Eli's toddler bed with the carved animals on the headboard, and I thought about the workshop, about everything that was still in it. About the gray metal safe in the back corner, 4 feet tall, bolted to the floor, and about the combination that was his mother's birthday and Eli's birthday compressed into 6 digits that only I would know to try. Then I called Harriet. Harriet Nakamura had been our real estate attorney when we purchased the house. I had her number because I keep everyone's number, and because I had understood from a decade of bookkeeping that having the right professional accessible before you need them is the only preparation that actually works. I told her what my mother had told me. I told her the address of the workshop. I told her that my husband had purchased it 7 years ago and that he had died 11 weeks ago, and that my parents had sold it without my knowledge. Harriet said, "Was the workshop in your husband's name or in both names?" I said I wasn't sure. I said that when he bought it, we weren't yet married, and I didn't know whether he had ever changed the title. She said, "I need to look at the county records. Can I call you back in an hour?" I said yes. I sat with Eli in the next room, and I read him a book he had already heard 40 times, the one about the bear and the honey, and I let the words of it occupy the surface of my mind, while underneath I ran the numbers. A bookkeeper understands structures. I had spent 10 years learning exactly how assets and liabilities and ownership were organized in the small businesses I worked for. A title defect in a real estate transaction is not a paperwork problem. It is a void. If the person who contracted to sell the property did not own the property, the buyer did not receive good title, regardless of what money changed hands or how many signatures were on the closing documents. The money could be gone. The property might not be. The workshop had sold for $240,000. My parents had no legal authority to sell a property that was not theirs. If the property was in Gideon's name alone, it would have been part of his estate, and I was the executor of his estate, and nobody had consulted the executor. If the property was in my name, which I did not know, which I had no record of, which I had never had occasion to investigate because Gideon handled the property matters, and I handled the business accounts, then the sale was not just procedurally wrong. It was void. Harriet called back in 52 minutes. She said, "The workshop parcel transferred to you in May of last year. your husband filed a quitclaim deed. The property has been in your name for 14 months. 14 months. Gideon had transferred the workshop to my name 14 months before he died. 4 months before he told me about the diagnosis. He had known before he told me, and the first thing he had done when he knew was transfer the workshop. I said, Harriet, my parents sold a property I own. She said, yes. And the sale needs to be unwound. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, your husband was careful. Whatever he was planning for, he was careful about it. I said, he always was. I want to stop here for a moment. If you have ever sat in a room full of someone else's work, surrounded by the evidence of what they built, and been told that someone sold it while you were learning to breathe again, leave one word below for me. Just one. I know what it means. And if you want to know what was in the safe, and why it mattered more than any of us understood that night, subscribe and stay. The combination is coming, I promise. I did not go to the workshop that night. I had Eli and I had no childcare, and I was not yet ready, in the grief sense, for what I might find. What I did instead was call my father. I called him directly, which I rarely did because my parents operated with my mother as the speaking member of the unit, my father as the presence who ratified her decisions by not contradicting them. He answered on the third ring, and I told him what Harriet had told me. I told him the workshop had been in my name for 14 months. I told him a sale of property you do not own is not a sale. My father was quiet for a long time. He said, Vera, we didn't know. I said, I know you didn't know, I didn't know either. But now we both know, and there is a problem. He said, we can't give the money back. It went to Denton's creditor, it's gone. I said, I understand that, I'm not asking for the money tonight. I'm asking you to understand what happened. He said, your mother thought she was helping. I had a response available to me and I held it. The response was, helping Denton has always looked exactly like this. It has always looked like someone else pays the price for the help. I held it because saying it would have made me feel accurate and would have made the situation worse, and I had learned from a decade of navigating my family that accuracy without utility is a luxury I could not afford that night. I said, Dad, she sold my property. He was quiet again. He said, I should have called you first. I should have insisted on that. I'm sorry, Vera, that sentence landed in a specific way. He had known what was happening and he had not insisted. That was not the same as doing it, and it was not the same as not knowing. It was his version of the thing, and I received it without unpacking it further because unpacking it further was not what that night required. I said, I know, Dad. I hung up. I put Eli to bed. I went to the kitchen and I sat at the table where Gideon had sat on the morning of his last Tuesday, and I looked at the cabinets he had built for me and the grain of the wood, and the specific way the joinery showed at the corners, visible but not proud, the mark of a craftsman who believed in the honesty of structure. I thought about the safe. I thought about the 6-digit combination. I thought about him showing it to me the week after we were married and saying, this is yours too. I went to bed. In the morning I drove to the workshop. I want to tell you about the morning I unlocked the workshop for the first time since Gideon died. The buyer had not yet taken possession. The sale was under challenge, and the title company had been notified by Harriet's office that a competing ownership claim existed. The buyer, a developer who had intended to tear down the structure and build something else on the land, had been informed that the transaction was disputed. The keys were, legally, still mine. I had left Eli with a neighbor. I had driven the 1.5 miles to the workshop with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. It was a Tuesday morning in June, 3 months and a week after Gideon had died, on a Tuesday morning making coffee. I sat in the car for a few minutes before going in. I want to tell you something about the specific difficulty of grief that I have not seen said exactly right in any of the places where people try to say it. It is not one feeling. It is a structure that lives inside you, and the structure has load-bearing parts and non-load-bearing parts, and you learn over the months which parts you can touch without collapsing and which you cannot touch yet. The workshop was one of the parts I had not touched. I had known it was there. I had not been ready. I unlocked the door. The smell of the workshop came through before I had the door fully open. Sawdust and finishing oil and something underneath that I cannot name because it is not a smell you can name exactly. It is the smell of a person's work accumulated over years, and it is specific to that person, and it does not go anywhere when they do. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went inside. Everything was as he had left it. The tools in their places. The wood stacked in the sequence he had stacked it. On the workbench nearest the door there was a piece in progress, a small side table, the legs shaped and the top cut but the assembly not yet begun. He had been working on it. He had gone home from this bench and made coffee the next morning and died, and the side table was still waiting. I put my hand on the top of the side table. The wood was smooth in the way it is smooth only after considerable time with the planes. He had spent hours on that surface. I could feel the hours in it. I sat in his chair, the battered one he kept at the workbench, and I put my hands on the surface he had worked on, and I cried in the way that had not been available to me in the 11 weeks since he died, which is to say completely and without management, because there was nobody in the room who needed me to be managing. I sat there for a while. Then I went to the back corner. The safe was there. Gray metal, 4 feet tall, bolted to the concrete floor. He had shown me the combination the week after we were married. 6 digits. His mother's birthday and then Eli's birthday compressed into a string of numbers that was not obvious to anyone who didn't know the dates. I crouched down. I turned the dial. 6 digits, right and then left and then right again. The safe opened. I want to tell you that I had a sense of what I might find in it, but I did not. I had not opened it since he showed me the combination. I had known it was there, and I had known the combination, and I had left it unopened in the way you leave things that belong to someone else alone, because the safe had been Gideon's way of organizing the things that mattered in the business, and I had not needed to access it, while he was there to access it himself. I was not prepared for what it contained. I am not a person given to drama, and what I found was not dramatic in itself. It was specific and complete, and it was the most thorough proof I have ever seen of what it means to love someone with intention. Gideon had been a cabinet maker for 12 years. He had also been a careful man. Careful in the way of someone who has watched things go wrong and has spent their career since then building systems to prevent it. He kept physical backups of everything that mattered. I had known this about him as a general principle. I had not known the specific contents of the safe because I had not needed to open it while he was alive. I am going to tell you what was in it, and I want you to understand that I am not a person given to drama, and that what I found was not what I expected. Cash, $11,400. His emergency fund, accumulated over years of setting aside a portion of each client payment. He had told me about the fund in a general way. I had not known the specific amount. Client contracts, 14 of them, the current and pending, organized in a red accordion folder with tabs in his handwriting. Each contract listed the project, the price, the deposit paid, the balance due. The 14 contracts represented work he had been contracted for but not yet completed. The combined value of the outstanding balances was $63,200. And at the back of the safe, in a manila envelope, sealed with tape and labeled in his handwriting Vera, for the record, was a set of documents. The quitclaim deed, the original, the one Harriet had found in the county records. His signature and mine, notarized, dated May of the previous year. I had signed it. I had signed it 14 months ago and had not remembered signing it because we had signed a great deal of paperwork around that time for reasons I had not been told. Under the quitclaim deed was a letter. I sat on the concrete floor of the workshop and I read my husband's letter to me. He had written it in May, the same month he transferred the deed. He wrote that he had not told me about the heart condition yet, that he was still processing it himself, that the cardiologist had said the prognosis was uncertain, and that uncertain meant he needed to prepare for a version of things he did not want to think about. He wrote that he had transferred the workshop to my name because the workshop was the most significant asset we had outside the house, and he needed it to be unambiguously mine. He wrote that the safe combination was his mother's birthday and Eli's birthday, and that I knew both. He wrote that the contracts in the red folder were all in progress, and that his colleague and friend Warren Pell knew all of them and could advise me on how to proceed if I ever needed to. He wrote, "I hope you never open this. I hope I am there to open it with you when the time comes and I can explain all of this in person and you can tell me I was being dramatic and we can put it all back and not think about it for another 20 years. He wrote, "If you are reading this alone, I want you to know that everything I built was for you and Eli, the workshop, the contracts, the money in the safe, the table on the workbench that I didn't finish, all of it." He wrote, "I love you, Vera, the deed is in your name." That was always going to be true. I sat on the concrete floor for a long time. The side table was on the bench behind me, waiting for its assembly. The tools were in their places. The smell of him was in every surface of that room. The light came in through the high windows the way it always came in, at an angle that shifted through the morning, and that I had watched from this floor before, sitting beside him when he worked, my back against the leg of the workbench, Eli asleep in his carrier on the workshop floor, because the workshop had always been a place Eli was welcome, because it was a place I was welcome, and Gideon had never separated those things. I read the letter again. I had read it once, and now I read it again more slowly, the way you read something a second time when the first reading was too large to fully take in. He had written, "I know you're going to be fine. I know because I've watched you for 5 years and you have never been not fine when it counted. What I'm asking you to do is let the workshop be a resource and not an obligation. Open the safe, call Warren, and decide from there. You don't have to keep it. You don't have to sell it. You just have to know it's yours." He had written, "Eli is going to want to know what a plane is. Take him to the workshop and show him. He's going to have opinions. Encourage them." He had written, "I love you, Vera. The deed is in your name. That was always going to be true." I sat with that sentence. That was always going to be true. He had not written, "I made it true." He had written that it was always going to be true, as if the transfer of the deed had been inevitable rather than chosen, as if the only question had been the timing. That was how he had understood it, and understanding it that way, that it was already true and he was only formalizing it, had made the act possible in the way that some things are only possible when you approach them from the right angle. I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I looked at the envelope labeled Vera, for the record, in his handwriting. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket, and I called Harriet. The buyer was a developer named Covington Properties, who had intended to clear the lot and build a commercial structure. They were not, Harriet told me, delighted to learn that the title was defective. They were not, she said, going to be cooperative about unwinding the transaction voluntarily. This was the hard stretch. I want to tell you about it without making it more or less than it was. I was a widow with a 3-year-old, and a bookkeeping practice that required my continued functioning, and a legal dispute that required Harriet's continued functioning, which cost money I had not budgeted for because I had not known I would need it. I had Gideon's life insurance, which was not enormous but was real and was there, and I had my own income, and I had the knowledge that the property was legally mine, and that the law around title defects was clear, and that Harriet had handled disputes of this kind before. What I did not have, for several months, was any resolution. The legal process is patient in a way that people in crisis are not, and I was in crisis in the specific way of a person who is managing one thing at a time and does not have the capacity for more. I worked. I put Eli to bed every night, and I read the bear book and the horse book, and a new one about a rabbit that he had strong opinions on, and when he was asleep I worked. I updated the books for my 4 clients. I ran the numbers that kept other people's businesses coherent. And I thought about the workshop, which was sitting 1.5 miles away, key in my possession, tools in their places, the side table on the bench, the safe on the floor with $11,400 inside it, and $63,000 worth of contracts in a red accordion folder. Harriet filed the title dispute in June. Covington's attorneys responded in July with the argument that they were a good-faith purchaser without knowledge of the defect. This had some technical merit and required Harriet to demonstrate, through the county records, that the quitclaim deed had been properly filed and available for inspection, and that a competent title search would have found it, which it would have. The deed was in the county records. It had been there for 14 months. The title company had missed it. Their examiner had not done the work. That was their exposure, and when Harriet made that case clearly, the title company understood what their liability looked like if the matter proceeded. The title company settled with Covington. My property was restored to my name. The question of my parents and the money was separate. The money was gone. It had flowed to Denton's creditor before anyone knew the title was defective, and retrieving it from a creditor who had received it in good faith was a different and longer problem than the property dispute. Harriet connected me with an attorney who handled that piece. My parents were not wealthy. They had a house with equity in it and retirement accounts that were modest, and a fixed income that covered their needs, without room for large, unexpected repayments. The money they had given to Denton's creditor was not available to return to me. What was available, after considerable discussion and 2 meetings that included both of my parents and their attorney and mine, was a home equity loan and a repayment structure. My mother was at both meetings. She sat in the way she sat when she had decided that dignity required stillness, which is to say without moving and without apologizing, and with the specific composure of a woman who has decided she did what she had to do and is waiting for the world to come around to her view of it. She said, at the end of the second meeting, that she was sorry for the way it had unfolded, but that she stood by her intention to help her son. I received that sentence without responding to it. It was not an apology. An apology is a reckoning with what was done. What she had given me was a clarification that she would have done it again if she had known the property was mine, which is the most honest thing she ever said to me and the most difficult. I am still deciding what to do with it. My father was different in those meetings. He had, since the phone call when he said I should have insisted, been a different quality of present. Not warm exactly, not forthcoming, but real in a way he had not been before. He looked at me differently. He had learned something about himself in the 11 weeks between Gideon's death and the phone call about the workshop, something about what his silence cost, and he was living with that knowledge in the way that people live with things that cannot be undone and can only be understood. The repayment was structured over 3 years. My parents paid the first installment in December. I want to tell you about Warren Pell. Warren was a craftsman who worked in a studio 3 blocks from the workshop and who had known Gideon for 8 years, since they had both been early tenants in the same building before Gideon bought his own space. He was 60, small and precise, with the specific economy of movement of a man who has spent decades in a workshop and has learned not to waste any of it. He had come to the funeral. He had stood at the back of the room and had not said very much and had left before the reception, which I had understood even in my grief as the behavior of a man for whom the formalities of grief were less important than the private experience of it. He had shaken my hand on the way out and said, "Gideon was the best I knew. That was all." He had meant it. He called me in July, 2 weeks after the title dispute was filed. He said he had heard, from someone in the building community who had heard from someone else, that there was a dispute about the workshop. He said he wanted me to know he was available if I needed him. He said that if I ever wanted to do anything with the workshop, to reopen it in some form, to manage the outstanding contracts, to sell the tools or the equipment, he knew the full landscape of what Gideon had been working on and he would help with any of it. I said, "The contracts." He said, "All 14 of them. I know all 14 clients." Gideon and I talked through everything. He was thorough. Of course he was. I said, "Can we meet?" We met the following Saturday at the workshop. I brought the red accordion folder from the safe. We sat at the workbench at the surface where Gideon had worked, and Warren walked me through each contract. I want to tell you what that Saturday morning was like, because it was one of the most specific and important mornings of the year that followed Gideon's death. Warren treated the contracts the way Gideon had treated everything, which was as specific things deserving specific attention. He did not generalize. For each of the 14 clients he told me the name, the project, what had been ordered, what deposit had been paid, what stage the work was at. For 3 of the clients he described conversations he and Gideon had had about the upcoming phases, because they had talked through the work the way craftsmen who respect each other talk through work, which is to say with the assumption that the other person understands the specifics and can be trusted with the thinking. Gideon had told Warren what he was building and how and why. Warren had retained everything. He had a memory for the work of a man who had spent 40 years paying attention to what was being made and by whom. There was a dining table for a family who had commissioned it for their daughter's wedding gift. There were built-in bookshelves for a professor who had been on Gideon's waiting list for 2 years. There was a cradle, ordered by a couple expecting their first child, that Gideon had sketched and had discussed with Warren in terms of the joinery and the wood species and the specific proportions that would make it right for many years of use. A cradle. He had been building a cradle. I sat at his workbench for a moment after Warren said that, and I did not say anything for a little while. Warren waited. He had the patience of a man who has spent his life working with materials that require patience and has internalized it completely. I said, "Can the cradle be finished?" He said, "Yes, I know exactly how he was going to do it." He showed me the sketches. Together, we worked out what could be completed by Warren and 2 other craftsmen he knew, what would need to be returned to the clients with their deposits, and what could be renegotiated given the circumstances. The clients, when contacted, were uniformly decent about it. 2 of them, who had been Gideon's clients for years, asked if there was anything else they could do. One of them sent a letter about the work Gideon had built for them that I have kept in the safe with the manila envelope. The outstanding contracts generated $41,000 in completed work over the next 8 months. It did not come close to replacing what Gideon had been to me. It was, in the most literal sense, the completion of what he had started. The work he had contracted to do, done by people who had known him and who understood that finishing it was a form of honoring it. The cradle was delivered in October. Warren made it. I drove it to the client's house with Eli in the back seat, and the young couple who came out to receive it were expecting their daughter in 6 weeks, and they stood in their driveway with their hands on the cradle and said nothing for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. I drove home. Eli fell asleep in the car seat. I sat in the driveway for a while before going in. Gideon had started that. Warren had finished it. Between them, they had taken an intention and made it real, and the child who would sleep in that cradle would never know the name of the man who sketched it or the man who built it, and that was exactly right. The work did not require credit. It required only that it be done. The workshop is still mine. I want to tell you what it is now. Warren uses it 3 days a week with my arrangement. He pays a nominal rent. That is not the point. The point is that it is used. That the tools are in their places and the wood is stacked, and the smell of sawdust and finishing oil is still what it was, because the work is still what it was, just in different hands. I go there on Sunday mornings when Warren is not in. I bring Eli, who is 4 now, and who is developing opinions about tools that I suspect will either terrify me or fill me with pride, or possibly both simultaneously. He likes to sit in his father's chair at the workbench and feel the surface of the wood. He does not have words yet for what he is doing, which is learning the texture of his father's world. I am not in a hurry to give him the words. Some things are better approached through the hands first. Last Sunday he asked me what the safe was. I told him it was where important things were kept. He asked what important things. I said, papers and letters and things that matter. He thought about it. He said, like my zoo. He meant the carved headboard on his toddler bed. I said yes, like your zoo. He accepted this and went back to running his hand along the edge of the workbench, which is something I have watched him do every Sunday, the same gesture, the same attention. He is 4 years old and he already moves through that workshop the way his father moved through it. Deliberate, unhurried, paying attention to what is actually there. The side table is finished. Warren finished it after I showed him the piece and told him where it had been in the sequence. He said he could tell from the shaping what Gideon had intended. He matched the finishing exactly, the same species of oil, the same number of coats, the same process. I watched him work on it over 2 afternoons, and I understood watching that Warren was doing what the good craftsmen do, which is not to replicate but to complete. To take up the intention of someone else's work and carry it to where it was going. It is in my living room now, next to the couch. It holds a lamp and a cup of coffee and whatever book I am reading. It is the most ordinary piece of furniture in the room and the most important. The safe is still bolted to the floor. I have not moved it and I have not emptied it. The letter is in it, in its manila envelope with the deed and the contracts. I open it sometimes, the way you open something that holds the most permanent version of a person. I read the letter and I put it back. I lock it. He said, I hope you never open this. I hope so too, my love. But I am glad it was there. I am glad you were careful. I am glad you knew the combination was his mother's birthday and Eli's birthday and that I would know both, and that you trusted me to come to the workshop eventually when I was ready and find it. My parents paid the last installment of the home equity repayment in February. My father called when it cleared. He said, I hope someday you can forgive us. I said I was working on it. That was the truest answer I had and it still is. My mother has not come to the workshop. She has come to the house to see Eli, and we have had the careful dinners that are now what our relationship is, which is to say surface warm and structurally cautious and more honest than it was before, because now we both know exactly where the edges are. That is not nothing. For my mother, that may be as much honesty as there is. I am not glad this happened. I want to be clear about that, because these stories sometimes tip toward a kind of narrative gratitude for the hard thing, as if the betrayal were necessary for the good that came after. It was not. The good that came after was there before. Gideon had put it there. He had filed the deed and written the letter and locked the safe and told Warren Pell everything worth knowing, and then he had gone home and made coffee on a Tuesday morning and died, and all of it had held without him there to hold it. Family is not the people who decide in your absence what your assets are worth. It is the people who put the deed in your name 14 months before they need to, who write the letter and seal the envelope, who build the red accordion folder and name the combination in terms you will know, who tell their colleagues your name so that when the time comes, the colleague can call. The people who were already building toward you before you knew you would need it. That is what Gideon was. That is what I carry. The safe was full. I did not know until I needed to know. He had made sure of it. That's my story. One gray safe bolted to a concrete floor that nobody thought to open. One quitclaim deed filed quietly in May, 14 months before it mattered. One letter that began, "I hope you never open this." And one man who built things that were supposed to outlast the building of them and who applied that principle to every choice he made, including the ones I didn't know about until I needed them. He had been a cabinet maker for 12 years. He had understood from the beginning of his career that good work required preparation, that the finishing was only as good as the joint underneath, that what held things together in the long run was never the surface. He had built his whole working life on that understanding. He had built his marriage on it too, and his fatherhood, and the quiet, systematic preparations he made in the months after his diagnosis, and he had done it all with the same unhurried attention he brought to the wood. He made sure the deed was in my name. He left the letter in the safe, sealed in the envelope with my name on it. He told Warren Pell everything worth knowing. The safe was full. He had made sure of it. If someone has been building toward you before you knew you'd need it, putting things in your name, keeping the records, making sure the deed is right, leaving the letter in the safe with your name on the envelope, tell them today. Before the morning they make coffee, before the Tuesday you don't know is coming. Comment below with one word for the thing someone built for you before you understood what they were building. Every word I read, and I know what each one means. Subscribe because the next story is just as specific, just as quietly earned, and just as complete. And it ends the way all the real ones always do, in the hands it was always meant to be in. I'll see you in the very next one.